Hello, friends. In our earlier lecture, we have studied the background to the modern age. In paper number 8, in modern age, or in our last lecture, we already discussed about the background to the modern age. Modern age itself is modern, but the modernity come at the expense of lots of other things. And what are the driving, say, conditions for the modernism that we need to discuss here? In our earlier, say, lecture, we have studied the background. We have studied the historical perspectives behind the modernism, the arguments and the debate that is going on in front of us among the philosophers, among the historicists, or among the other, say, so-called literary studies. Okay, so it's a it's a clear cut. Uh, we have it's clear cut in the sense we have definitely various ages over the history that reflected some kind of a rational thought, some kind of a enlightenment, some kind of a new innovations. At the same time, there is a drastic change in the thought process, and all these are reflected in the literature from which the age has produced. The modern age, in the sense, some of the driving features that we have studied in our earlier lecture. But this is not the say space where we can go in detailed discussion, but few more important points that we need to think about. At the outset, I have already told you that in the 19th century, we have industrial revolution in the European countries and the industrial product. Okay, the raw material that is imported into England from Africa, from colonial nations, suppose India or Indian subcontinent was under the suzerainty of the British Empire. Suzerainty means under control. So Britishers were the rulers. They have, say, stealed our wealth, so-called wealth, in each and every, say, field of um, the Indian heritage. So whatever the driving features for modernism, or whatever the things are, but at the same time, when we study this modernism, we have to think about industrial revolution, the impact of revolution, industrial revolution on the masses. The people were the people were suffering because they have enough money but no food to eat. Some of the people, or the women in particular, were drastically reduced to the slavery, reduced to the so-called prostitution. The Streets of London, if you read the Benjamin Disraeli's novels, you will find that the the condition of Victorian women was very drastic, very bad, in a very precarious conditions, and uh, the 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 need for the money, the need for livelihood is very urgent, but it finds the the manifestation of the utter frustration of the Victorian women. And there are certain needs of social reforms, and these social reforms are brought in 1870s onwards. And with the publication of very good novels by Thomas Carlyle, uh, Charles Dickens, we have. Hard Times, Great Expectations, David Copperfield. So these two novelists brings us the picture of the Victorian society and Victorianism. Victorianism, of course, is an age of religion as well as it's the new innovation and research and scientific developments that were taking place in the Victorian era. But irrespective of all that, the entire thought process of the Victorian era was changed, and definitely it was leading to the modernity. We have studied that the impact of the Sigmund Freud means is the only he was the first so-called psychologist who unearthed the depths of mind, who propagated his own theory of psychology, and that it was very innovative at the time that human mind can be studied, human behavior can be studied, and the psychological analysis, the how the human mind is made of. He propagated his three theories: id, ego, and superego, and how these features are definitely in your literary theory and criticism paper. You are going to study that. But instead of going into the detailed description of psychology here, but what we need is that during the last 2 decades of 19th century, we have very good psychologist Henry James, William James, whose Principles of Psychology was the inspiring work for the novelist of the age. And instantly, it was a new technique that was adopted by the novelist. Suppose Virginia Woolf is there, Dorothy Richardson was there. At the same time, uh, James Joyce was there. So they adopted this new innovative technology and technique, and through there, the characters were the landscape of the mind. It's a plateau of the mind where the characters can be developed to a certain extent, and it goes on. It's it's a kind of a psychological expression, exploration of the characters. It is it is the journey, and through this, there are various techniques that were uh, implemented and imparted in the novels by Virginia Woolf, Dorothy Richardson, whose pilgrimage Prime Minister Dorothy Richardson's novels, and Virginia Woolf is very to the Lighthouse is a very famous book cast in a psychological narration. There are certain techniques that they at the initial stage used, and it all stands for the stream of consciousness technique, the use of interior monologue, the psychological journey exploration, the dream sequences, the visionary sequences, where the part and were dominated in most of the pages when we read the novels. It consumes lots of pages of the novels. So psychology become one of the major feature of the literary expressions. So for poetry is concerned, poetry become much more psychological. Poetry become much more the expression of the subjective soul or the mind or the behavior or the thought process of the poet. It reveals, it is expected that the poet reveals his own psychology. It becomes much more subjective. It reflected what the poet has experienced within himself, and that we see in the literature. When we study the novels and the poetry from the era, At the same time, in very late part of 19th century, we have definitely some of the literary development that has occurred. It was again the rise the of so-called comedy of manners, the dramatic term as you might have studied. Okay, again at the same time, very Oscar Wilde is an Irish playwright, poet, and dramatist, and essayist also. Oscar Wilde wrote a very beautiful importance of being earnest drama. It's very landmark drama in which was published in 1896. It was brought to the stage. It get very good critical acclaim and was very playboy of the Western world. It's another famous drama that was uh, in this particular era. Whatever the impact of this, it is on the verge of the 20th century, which we say as the beginning of modernism. As we are on the verge of उंबरठा आपण म्हणतो. ह्या उंबरठ्यावर जेव्हा मॉडर्न एज आलं तेव्हा जे आपण व्हिक्टोरियन एरा जो आपण स्ट्रेच करतो until 1903 we have Victorian era, but it's roughly okay. We don't have the clear cut compartmentalization. We can definitely have some say blurry boundaries. Okay, it's not clear cut, it's blurry boundaries, but whatever, we just have to think about the modernism said to have begun very much earlier. At least we can take 2 decades in the 19th century because there were certain developments that we see. So decadent, okay, and other such of features that we see. Okay, so when we study these features, we definitely need to think about. Okay, suppose if we go through these so-called points, I would like to show you these things. Okay, so the what are the features and in what way the modernism is to be understood. So what are the features of modernism? See, all these points will definitely help you to develop certain ideas, certain philosophy, a kind of a write-up, we can say, for 5 to 6 pages of write-up in the modernism. Whatever the features of modernism are, definitely we have a very good example in the form of decadent writing, and it is decadent writing that Oscar Wilde wrote. Art for art's sake, Edgar Allan Poe. Arts for art's sake. Art is for only art's sake. Art doesn't have any moral aim outside its own. Art should exist in its own self-sufficiency. Okay, art is only for art. It is not for any practical use. It should be appreciated. It should be praised. It should be looked in a beautiful way. So the authors needs to portray and paint and decorate the work of art, whether it's painting. It's a movement. Decadent is a movement that arose in the later part of the 19th century, and all these we say have become the part of us, which continued in the first decade of the 20th century. In the second decade of the 20th century, we do have the outbreak of the First World War and its utter frustration. So many allies and enemy countries participated in the First World War, which caused a great havoc to the humanity. It caused great havoc to the masses, and it entirely changed the, the fundamental philosophy of the human civilization. The war ravaged European nations, the burnings of the cities, the burning of London, major cities, the devastation, the mass killing has brought the man right to the basics. What is going to rest the world in the coming future? What are the civilizational, say, teachings, morality that we expected? So it is a utter frustration. And there were some of the philosophers, thinkers who thought that the Western civilization is no more useful. As I told you in the last lecture, that Western civilization is no more useful for the humanity, and the European nation, which was devastated, became the modern man's wasteland. It was it was utter frustrations. All our thoughts, all our things are not going to be useful. All our living is not. We are living in a cage, in a rat's hole. In some of the poem, it's written. We are living in a rat's hole. We are not living in a beautiful world. It's a rat's hole. It's a modern man's wasteland. It's a wasteland. Everywhere there is a massacre, there is a frustration, there is a pollution. Industrial revolution has brought the pollution, the bloody and black cities. So it causes the pessimism in the minds of people. But in this pessimism, this wasteland, this frustration needs to be depicted somewhere, written somewhere. And the poet and the novelist brought this utter frustration, the lived experiences of the modern age into literature, and that becomes the realism. So the poets were realist by nature. At the same time, the poetry technique was moving on. There was slightly changes in the, say, writing strategies. So there were certain writing strategies that we see. So it becomes transitional. In the second and third, we have Georgian poets, okay, those poets who were uh, very much writing in King George's rule. We have imagist, realism, and imagism. See, images were used. What the intended thought deeper in the psychology of the poet is very deeply impregnated in the meaning are directly offered to the readers. These are put forth in just like a picturesque way. So imagism is another literary movement that is arised. We are going to study imagism as a literary movement in the next, say, so-called lectures. It was a period of great war as we have studied. 1914 to 1980, we have seen the First World War, that are devastation, frustrations, and that has brought a very good war poet, Odin, Wilfred Owen. Wilfred Owen wrote the greatest war poet, futility, insensibility. Okay, they'll see at these are very famous war poet. So war become the heated topic. War has caused the pessimism, frustration, devastations. So war is always in the background when we study the modern age. The poet is a sensitive animal. Poet turn again to nature to find out the subjects The traffic and very third of the trains, ships, airplanes has entirely changed our life in the modern age. So all that reflected. The elements of psychology also continued in the rest part of the modern age. And we have seen there are remarkable novels, remarkable contributions that are made by James Joyce's Ulysses, T.S. Eliot's Westland, and definitely one more that is one of the remarkable contribution that we see. So there were decadence, disillusionment, frustrations, and loss of faith, all that caused the utter pessimism. The poets were bringing the down to earth realism, directly bringing the picture bleak and frustrating pictures of the American, European society or the American society or uh, the so called London life. It is very well and a very, say, newly adopted and developed technique by T.S. Eliot in a cinematographic technique. One more point that I would like to quote here is the use of mythology. As we have seen, the Westland has a mythical background. T.S. Eliot used the mythology of Tiresias. Okay, Tiresias is a mythological figure who got the immortality, who struck the copulating snake. Okay, copulating snake, and then he was blindfolded. He was blind, and but he was with immortality. Tiresias wished to die, but he could not die. He was he was old because he was blind because he was see the fairy that comes out of the snakes. Okay, and he was made to suffer, and that we see in the Tiresias myth. The myth has been adopted in the Westland. So all these features that we see are the modern features, modern age features. One by one, there are some of the points or terms that we are going to discuss in detail. These terms have emerged as the literary movements. At the same time, when I just quoted images or symbols, so symbolism is again one of the movement, and it continued in the, say, 20th century literature. Whatever points that I just made, symbolism is one of the driving uh, aspect of literary creation that has revolutionized the entire concept of symbolism with the addition of psychological background. At the same time, the newly adopted technique, the symbols are directly brought from the deeper depths of the minds and subconscious mind. So symbolism has lots of things to do with the plot of the novel, with the story of the, say, drama or the themes of the poem. So with these, definitely I think it would help you a lot to just frame some ideas about modernism and about the background of the modernism. So I hope you will get some kind of a gist out of this. Definitely, we are going in detail when we study the syllabus, or when we study the each and every terms and concepts in detail. So, in our next lecture, definitely we will go through some of the points that are very necessary and relevant. You will get the content, and you can definitely get the PDF format. The notes you will get in PDF format, whatever points that you have to make. If you listen to these video lectures, definitely draw some points, draw some hints. If some of the major titles that I have just quoted, these are the part and parcel of this write-up, Modernism. Okay, so you are expected to collect these kernels of thought and knowledge.